Okay, well, next up, we're happy to hear from Dr. Andrew Weaver. Andrew, I think I first met you at what do they call it? The Young Guns Genetics Summit they put us at with the Sheep Genetics USA in Colorado. Um, but then after that, um, he did come down to the National Ram Sale. Was that a year ago now?
Yeah, it was last year.
Yeah, yeah. So I have met Andrew, very impressive individual. We got to hear from Dr. Brodridge yesterday, who he worked with, and I'm excited to hear Andrew talk a little bit more about the National Sheep Improvement Program, and especially with the in-depth discussion we had yesterday about improving genetic potential and things like that with our St. Croix sheep. So with that, Andrew, I'll go ahead and let you take it away. Thank you.
Sounds good. Well, yeah, thanks for the invitation to speak. Sorry I can't be there in person. I'm actually planning to come back out to the National Ram Sale here in a few weeks. And so 2 trips to Utah in a month was just a little bit too much for my schedule. So glad we have Zoom and this technology, and hopefully you can see everything all right. And I'll have my email contact information at the end here, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions at the end. So with that, I want to share a little bit of overview of the National Sheep Improvement Program, opportunities for you all that might be seed stock producers, and also opportunities for commercial producers, because I really think this is a program, and the tools that it provides can benefit all segments of the industry. We typically think of it as more of maybe a purebred tool, a purebred organization. And yet I think we don't always realize or maybe appreciate to the full extent that the value that it can provide to the commercial sector within the sheep industry. So I've kind of got this tailored towards St. Croix, but certainly relevant. The concepts here relevant across all breeds, and we welcome all breeds in NSIP. So we actually welcome goats as well. So all inclusive. So yeah. So to get into this and a little more detail on NSIP here. What is the National Sheep Improvement Program? I'll probably refer to it as NSIP from this point forward. So that's what the acronym means. NSIP coordinates the genetic evaluation for the U.S. sheep industry. And so a little bit different in the sheep world versus the cattle world. I don't know if there's any cattle producers in the audience this morning, but within the cattle industry, we work with our breed associations. Angus runs an evaluation. Red Angus, Simmental, some of those breeds work together for their evaluation, but it's largely housed, that evaluation is housed within that breed association or couple breed associations. And so in the sheep industry, we have many breed associations, lots of diversity, which is a positive thing and can be a challenge in some regards. And then we have this National Sheep Improvement Program that sort of serves as maybe like you can think about it as a blanket organization that coordinates the genetic evaluation for all of those breeds. NSIP is not housed within a breed association, works with breed associations, but it's technically different. And you can register animals in a breed association and also enroll them in NSIP. There's some sheep enrolled in NSIP that are not registered with their respective breed association. And so the two organizations are technically separate and independent entities. And so if you're interested in acquiring and utilizing and having available these genetic tools that we're going to talk about today, that involves enrollment in the National Sheep Improvement Program. If you're already a purebred producer, adding on the NSIP enrollment would be a small extra fee, but gives you a lot of very powerful information as a result of that. And we're going to talk about what that is and how that can be of benefit today. And so the tools, the primary tool that NSIP provides is what's called estimated breeding values. And we'll go into a little bit more depth on what those are here in a minute. They are the most powerful selection tool we have available, and they're available for a wide variety of what we call economically relevant traits. So traits that generally controlled by many genes and maybe a little bit more difficult to describe with qualitative molecular genetic methods. And so instead, we use quantitative genetics to describe these traits and genetic merit differences between individuals for these traits. And so these traits are any trait that you can apply dollars and cents to. So they have an economic impact on your bottom line from both an input side and an output side. You know, prolificacy traits, growth traits, parasite resistance traits, carcass traits, all of those we have EBVs for. So where this really stems from, and the reason that these tools are so powerful is if we jump back a minute and kind of get back to the foundation of evaluating animals and genetic merit of individuals and allowing us and what can allow us to accurately identify superior from inferior. We have to remember that phenotype and genotype are two different things. One contributes to the other. The phenotype, so what we observe about an animal. So this is sometimes it's thought of as visual appraisal, structural attributes, things like that. The way the animal looks. It could also be that weaning weight. It could be the birth type. It could be the weaning type. It could be that raw fecal egg count. Any of those raw data points, selection measures, any of those, the visual appraisal things that we, the things we enjoy about looking at, the sheep that we have, all of those are phenotypes, and that phenotype is controlled by the genetics of that individual plus the environment that they are exposed to. And so some traits have a larger genetic component than others. And so environment, the impact of environment on expression of those traits and the resulting phenotype will vary depending on the trait. And so if we want to make a real broad generalization, about 20% of what we observe in a trait, about 20% of that phenotype that we observe is controlled by genetics. The rest would be controlled by environment. So that means about, on average, again, this is a pretty general statement, on average, 20% or so is controlled by genetics, 80% is controlled by environmental factors, our management, nutrition, the weather outside, all of those things. And so we have some traits that are what we call lowly heritable, that have a lower, smaller genetic component. Those would be primarily our prolificacy traits, our maternal traits, milk production. And then we have traits that are more highly heritable. Those are generally our carcass traits and our wool traits. And then we have a number of traits that exist in the middle. Our weight traits, growth, weaning weight, post-weaning weight, parasite resistance, hair shedding. Those all fall in that middle range, 20 to 25% or so. And so the challenge becomes, if we just look at an animal visually, if we just take a raw performance metric, are we selecting on an environment or are we selecting on their true genetic potential? Environment changes even within your farm. The environment this year is probably going to be a little bit different than the environment next year. The environment this year is probably a little bit different than the environment was last year. So environment's going to change year to year. On the same operation, environment's certainly different. By farm, you might feed a little bit more or less than what I feed. Certainly Utah is a very different environment than North Carolina. And so if we're not careful and all we are doing is evaluating phenotypes, we may be, biasing our selections. We may be inaccurately identifying superior animals. We may be picking animals that maybe performed really well because of environmental conditions. My nutrition program is really good. I feed a lot of grain. I have sheep that are fat and happy and look really good. And then they go out to Utah and they get turned out on rangeland and they've never seen range conditions before. And in a month or two, they look like a completely different creature. Their genes are the same. The genetics are the same. The DNA didn't change. The environment changed though. So, and that change in environment resulted in a change in phenotype. And so we need to be able to isolate genetics from environment. We need to be able to parse those two things apart and say, this portion of that trait was contributed by environment. This portion is contributed by genetics. Let's select, let's improve, let's focus on that genetic component, and then make sure that that animal is going to fit into the environment that we are asking it to perform in. And so this is where EBVs, estimated breeding values, become really powerful in that they isolate the genotype from the environment. They tell us what portion of that phenotype is actually genetics, genetic merit. What are those differences between individuals? And it separates that, isolates that from those environmental factors that are going to be variable farm to farm, year to year. Because the genetics, the DNA, that's going to stay, that DNA sequence is going to stay the same regardless of where we put that animal, regardless of what we feed the animal. I can sell a Katahdin ram here that we raised here in North Carolina. I can sell it to Washington State, the other side of the country. The environment could be very different, but the DNA is the same. So it allows me to now make more accurate selection decisions, and make true genetic improvements, without being distorted, or having those decisions distorted by environmental factors. So what contributes to an EBV? And this is the other real benefit of breeding values, is that it's not just based on one data point at one point in time. Rather, we have a lot of data points that all feed into the genetic evaluation that ultimately spits out the estimated breeding value that we get to use to make decisions. And so it starts with relative performance. We, known pedigree information. So, what's the genetic merit of mom and dad? What about the grandparents, aunts, uncles? These EBVs take into consideration all individuals in the known pedigree. So the bigger that pedigree is, the more well known it is, the more information that's in that pedigree, the more powerful EBV we're starting out with. From the day the animal's born, if we know the pedigree, we can calculate a pedigree-based breeding value. From there, we build in individual performance. So did they perform better or worse than what we would expect based on all of that pedigree information? We can adjust that breeding value maybe up a little bit. We might adjust it down a little bit, depending on how they perform relative to kind of what's expected from their parents. We build in sibling performance, half sibling performance, full sibling performance. And so this becomes really powerful in evaluating sires and dams, because we might have, one ram, we certainly use him on a number of females. We have a bunch of half sib lambs, and we can evaluate those half siblings, certainly within the same contemporary group on the same farm. But, what if I use a ram on my farm and then I send him to your farm and you use him on your farm? And now we have half siblings on two different farms, two different contemporary groups. And now that provides genetic connectedness between our operations, and allows us to start comparing the genetics of individuals on your farm with the genetics of individuals on my farm. And we can better evaluate what is that animal's true genetic potential, through these progeny and different contemporary groups. And so build in that sibling performance, build in the progeny performance. What are they actually passing on to the next generation? We can do a pretty good job of predicting what they are as individuals, before they reach maturity, but it gets that much better once we can build in that progeny information. We build in genetic correlations between traits. And so we know traits like the weaning fecal egg count is going to be related to the post-weaning fecal egg count. If they're more parasite resistant early on in life, they're probably going to be more parasite resistant later on in life. Weaning weight, we know that if they're heavier at weaning, they're probably going to be heavier at the post-weaning time point too. So we're able to use genetic correlations to better predict genetic merit of those traits that share genes. And then relatively recently, fall of 2021, genomics came online for our hair sheep, and we're able to actually build in and utilize markers in that genetic sequence to better predict what that breeding value is. And so we get back to outlining these breeding values, why they're so important, why they're so useful and a valuable tool. Like I said, they're predictors of genetic merit. They isolate genotype from environments. They allow us to assess true genetic potential, independent of environmental factors. They're the most accurate selection tool available because they contain a lot more information than just one data point. It's great to have a weaning weight, but that weaning weight only means so much, right? That weaning weight is influenced by a lot of things. I would much rather have a genetic metric of weaning weight that takes into account not only that individual's weaning weight, but also what about the parent's weaning weight, progeny weaning weights, genomic information, genomic markers that contribute to weaning weight, things like that. And so by taking all of that information into account, we have a much more powerful, accurate selection tool than what raw performance data is, adjusted performance data, RAM test data. So it really becomes the most powerful, best tool in our selection toolbox. I'm not going to say this is the only tool we should ever use. I think we need to combine breeding values with visual appraisal of structure and breeding soundness and things like that. But they are a very, very powerful tool for making genetic progress over time. So how do we make genetic progress? Not to get into too much math here on a Saturday morning, but want to think about this from more of a conceptual standpoint. If we want to change genetics, that is impacted or influenced by the accuracy of selection, selection intensity, genetic variation within that population. We take all that, multiply those together, divide by the generation interval, and we can predict our change in genetics. And so accuracy is simply how well can we predict the genetics of that individual, how accurately can we identify, superior from inferior. And there's a correlation factor between estimated breeding values and true breeding values. And so you'll notice, I've been saying estimated breeding values. Our sheep have true breeding values. They have a specific DNA sequence. They have a specific merit. Our statistical tools only allow us to predict that so well. We don't fully genotype sequence every gene in the entire genome of that animal on every animal. And so we're using statistical models to predict, to estimate what that breeding value is based on a number of factors. And we can get pretty close to the true breeding value, but we never get to exactly. The accuracy is never 100%. It can be up in the 90s, but it's always an estimated breeding value relative to what that true breeding value is. Selection intensity is the superiority of the selected population compared to the average. So how much better are the animals we're retaining and utilizing for breeding relative to the average? And so the more superior they are, the faster we're going to make genetic progress. Genetic variation is just the variability within a population. There has to be variability to make progress, right? If all individuals are exactly the same, how do we change that? And so we have to have variation. We have to have some good animals, some bad animals, so that we can identify the good ones and move the population in that favorable direction. And then generation interval is simply the average age of the parents when the offspring are born. If we can decrease the generation interval, get younger ewes, younger rams into production, that's going to turn over those generations that much faster and accelerate genetic progress. And so if we want to really simplify this, the key to genetic progress is making the stuff on the top of this equation bigger, improved accuracy, greater selection intensity, more genetic variation, and making the stuff on the bottom of this equation smaller, decreasing the generation interval, turning over those generations faster. For the sake of today's presentation, we're really going to focus on these top two: improvement in accuracy and greater selection intensity. Genetic variation is relatively fixed within a population. There's only so much we can do there. Generation interval, that's a whole nother topic of discussion in terms of how we get those young animals into production sooner and make sure they stay in the flock for a longer period of time. And there's a lot to discuss there. And so we're not going to worry about that for the sake of today's presentation. So how do we improve accuracy? Simply put, we collect more records. The more we know about something, the better we can predict it, the more accurately we can evaluate it. So we need more records. We could use proven genetics. That would be an option. Proven rams, proven ewes, for that matter, they have more progeny. We know how those progeny have performed, and we can utilize what we know about progeny performance to better evaluate the genetics of those proven individuals, and so we could utilize those proven individuals with maybe a little bit more confidence. We know what what they're more likely to pass on to that next generation. The problem is, and we go back to generation interval for a second. It takes a while to prove a ram, right? They have to be developed themselves. Even if we use them as a ram lamb, they're 7, 8, 9 months old when we use them the first time. We've got 5 months of gestation and then another 2 to 6 months worth of development of those offspring. And so now, just to get one lamb crop out of a ram, that ram is a year and a half, coming 2 years old before we really know what his progeny are going to do. And that's just one lamb crop. And so if we think about that generation interval, we're really increasing that generation interval. The more of those proven rams that we utilize, and waiting to get some information before we really put them to heavy use. And so there's some pros and cons there. I'm not going to say like go all the way in one direction or another, but just something to consider. We need to understand the pedigree. And I think this is one that, studying pedigrees, understanding, you know, ewe family, sire lines, what consistent traits are being passed along those lines. I think that can go a long ways in helping us make accurate decisions. I love this quote by a famous quarter horse breeder. After this, I want to know the answer to the all important question: what about her folks? Did she get all this honestly, or is she a freak? It's great to have that lamb that is an outlier, right? And it could truly be an outlier that's going to pass on those extreme traits to their offspring. That's a possibility. It could also be an outlier. It could be a freak for a variety of other reasons, and those genes may never get passed on to the next generation. But if the parents are outliers and the progeny are outliers, then I have a lot more confidence that that next generation is also going to be, outliers. And so, like we put a lot of emphasis on selection for parasite resistance. If I can find a sire line that's known for parasite resistance, a ewe family that's known for parasite resistance, and pair those up, I have quite a bit of confidence that the resulting offspring are going to be relatively parasite resistant. And then finally, we need to make sure we use the appropriate tools. And so estimated breeding values are our most accurate selection tool for the reasons previously discussed. And so utilizing those and that metric to make decisions relative to, or instead of just actual, raw performance data, can go a long ways in helping us more accurately identify superior individuals. And so more data, more accuracy. So this slide is really targeted at you all that are purebred producers, that are raising stud bucks, replacement ewe lambs, that you're selling to commercial producers or other seed stock producers. And so I encourage you to collect data on economically relevant traits. And these are going to vary by operation, right? They're not the same for all of us. But think about what's important to your customer base, and then collect those traits that are important to you and your customer base. And so, prolificacy traits, number born, number weaned, survival is going to be built into that. Weaning and post-weaning weights, fecal egg counts, if parasite resistance is something you want to focus on and something your customers need in their flocks. Scrotal circumference, birth and weaning date. We need to have a reference date for when these different activities, when these different measurements take place. And so we need that as well. So you're going to collect all that, submit that. All of that information can be submitted to NSIP for the generation of estimated breeding values. And so you submit this data. There's a data run twice a month, kind of the 1st and the 15th of every month, plus or minus a day or two. And so submit the data. You're going to get back within a few days these estimated breeding values. These estimated breeding values will, you'll have traits, growth traits, birth, weaning, post-weaning weights, maternal traits like prolificacy traits. Maternal weaning weight is a metric of milk production and maternal ability. Parasite resistance traits, if you're submitting fecal egg counts. EBVs also exist for carcass traits. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about those today, but for some of our terminal breeds, we do have those as well. And so those can be very valuable, especially for terminal sire selection. And so I encourage you as a purebred producer, if you're not already enrolled in an SIP, get enrolled and be able to collect the data, submit the data, and provide these breeding values, not only for your own internal selection, but also so that your customers can make more accurate selection decisions. So then moving on from accuracy, selection intensity is the other metric there or trait that contributes to genetic progress that I want to discuss here. So this is referring to increasing the selection differential or genetic reach, which is simply the difference between the selected individual, selected population relative to the average. So if most of within most of our populations, most of our herds, breeds, if we think about any trait, it's going to be relatively normally distributed. So the vast majority of the population is going to be around average, and then we have some extremes out at either end. We have some outliers in a good way and outliers in a bad way, right? And so let's just say I want to move to the right here, in that positive direction. I have individual one here. That difference between individual one and the average would be that selection differential. But what if I had a second individual, right? What if I had individual two here in green? Which one is going to provide the greater selection intensity, the greater selection differential? It's going to be individual two, right? Individual two is more extreme, more of an outlier for whatever trait this is. Individual two is going to move the population further to the right in that next generation, that first generation that it's going to produce. And so by identifying individuals that are more extreme, that are further out towards one of the tails here of our bell curve, we can apply greater selection intensity and change traits, improve traits more rapidly. So accurate selection of individuals that have favorable traits that are going to move our population of animals in the right direction is really the key to making quite a bit of progress in a relatively short amount of time. So one of your fellow St. Croix breeders shared some of her data with me, and this is a really relatively small population size here. This is just a group of ram lambs out of one lamb crop, and so a relatively small population size. But I want to use it to help illustrate, I think, the opportunity that St. Croix breeders have to utilize NSIP and the value that data, those EBVs can provide to you. And if you're not a St. Croix breeder, you can apply this to any breed, really. And so just using some St. Croix data here for reference in this presentation, but these are just a distribution of raw weaning weights. It's straight up weaning weights. I didn't adjust them for anything. This is just actual weaning weights collected on a group of ram lambs. And so, we have lambs there and I just sorted this from the lightest weaning weights to the heaviest weaning weights. And we have some lambs that are, in the 30-pound range at weaning. We have some lambs that are over 60 pounds at weaning. So raw weights, what's going to influence this? Is this the distribution here? Are the differences in weights between these individuals, is that all genetic? The answer is no, right? This is going to be influenced. These weaning weights are going to be influenced by a lot of things. Litter size. Those ones on the far left, I'd venture to guess those probably come from larger litters. Those are probably twin, triplet litters. Those couple individuals on the right, maybe they're coming from litters of singles. Dam age plays into it. Younger ewes and older ewes generally have lighter lambs. Ewes in that 3, 4, 5 year range generally have wean the heaviest lambs. The age that they were weaned at, if they're weaned at an older age, they're going to be heavier, right? And so that's the importance of knowing a birth date, knowing a weaning date, and being able to adjust that weight to a constant age. So we're not having that age factor. That age factor can be a pretty significant factor in weaning weights. What if it's just a bad weight? Like, what if we're all humans, we all make mistakes. What if it just comes across the scale and that scale, it just locks in on a weight maybe too quickly. Maybe we're leaning on the scale and don't realize it. There's any number of things could happen that, just human error in collecting a weight. What if that animal just had a bad day, right? What if they're have subclinical disease going on? We don't know it. They're a little emptier, gut fill. That's quite a bit of weight. What if they're just a little bit emptier than what, maybe they would be normally? We don't notice that, but maybe they are. So they weigh a few pounds lighter. Those human error things, those, things like subclinical disease that have not much, not necessarily a genetic component, but just are fluke things that happen at a point in time. That could change that weight plus or minus potentially a few pounds, right? And those few pounds could be the difference between keeping an individual for breeding and culling them. What happens if we cull an individual with really good genetics just because they had a bad day that day they crossed the scale? On the flip side, we could, maybe keep an animal for breeding that had the best day of their life and weighed heavier than what they really should. And so all of those things that you start floating around the back of your mind and to me raise some questions about, what's genetic, what's environmental. If I'm making this decision that's going to have potentially years worth of implications, I want to do the best job I can at identifying animals that truly have improved genetic merit for the traits that I'm interested in. And so here on this graph, I weaning weight, that raw weaning weight is on the x-axis. And then I've plotted that against the weaning weight estimated breeding value for those individuals. So these individuals, I have what their raw weaning weight was and then what their relative weaning weight estimated breeding value was determined to be. And you can see that it is a general positive trend, right? Generally speaking, if they're heavier at weaning, they have greater weaning weight breeding values. But that's not always the case, right? It's not a perfect correlation. And so let's just talk about two individuals. We have individual one here, weaning weight about 60 pounds or so. Weaning weight estimated breeding value about 1 or so. But then we have individual two here. Individual two has a weaning weight of 40 pounds. And what's the weaning weight estimated breeding value? It's about the same, right? So they have different, 20-pound difference in actual weaning weight, but they actually have the same weaning weight estimated breeding value, which tells me they have the same genetics, they have the same genetic potential for weaning weight. From a genetic standpoint, they're the same, but we have a 20-pound difference in actual weights. And so, what could be causing this? How do we describe this? What is potentially going on here? What if lamb number one is a single? Lamb number one was a single. Its parents and its siblings are lower than average for weaning weight. So actually, based on that pedigree information, based on half sibling, full sibling performance, we're like, that lamb really should not have weighed that much at weaning from a genetic standpoint. It was a single, so got some extra groceries, grew a little faster than what we would expect if it had been a twin or a triplet. And so really, this individual one, all the things were going in its favor, right? It had a great environment. It was a single, didn't have much competition. Those environmental factors were very favorable for that animal to do well. From a genetic standpoint, and when we incorporate all of those known factors into the calculation of that breeding value, you really step back and say, that individual, its genetics for weaning weight, what it is going to pass on to the next generation, really is not that great, because none of its siblings did really well, and its parents, when they were lambs, they didn't do very well. So let's take a step back here and maybe not overvalue that animal based on that one individual weaning weight. Individual two on the flip side, individual two is a triplet. Individual two, is had to compete with a big litter, got by, weaned at 40 pounds, competing with other siblings. Its parents, its siblings generally have performed better than average up to weaning. They were heavier, and so individual two, while the raw weaning weight was lighter, genetically speaking, when we go and calculate that breeding value, you look at the bigger picture and say, weaning lamb two actually has some pretty good genetics for weaning weight. If I were to utilize lamb number two in a breeding program, that individual, despite being a little bit lighter phenotypically, is going to have the genotype, the genetics to pass on favorable genetics for weaning growth or growth up to that weaning time point. And so again, those EBVs are very powerful because they consider multiple data points from both the individual as well as the pedigree to provide us, more accuracy and a more powerful tool to identify, true genetic differences and not just phenotypic differences. And so this graph here just shows weaning weight EBV relative to post-weaning weight EBV, our two growth traits. And I think the exciting thing here, even within this small population, there's a selectable range, right? They're not all the same. They're not all right at zero. They're not all at the same metric. There are differences. There's good individuals and there's bad individuals. And so by looking at these EBVs, we can accurately identify the good from the bad. If I want to improve growth in my St. Croix sheep, I could pick one of these individuals on the upper right with more favorable growth genetics, and they're going to pass on those growth genetics to the next generation. Just a quick example with fecal egg counts. Same story here, right? We have these raw fecal egg counts. They're influenced by a lot of things. And so just phenotypically that, it's a starting point. It gives us a basis, but there's a lot of things that's going to influence what these raw fecal egg counts are. So what's genetic, what's environmental? Um, Again, similar graph here. Our post-weaning fecal egg count is along the x-axis. Post-weaning fecal egg count estimated breeding value is on the y-axis. Here, slightly different scenario. Let's look at lamb number 1 here and lamb number 2. These individuals have the same fecal egg count. They're both about 500 eggs per gram on fecal egg count, but they have pretty different fecal egg count EBVs, right? Like lamb number 1's pretty good, low fecal egg count EBV, favorable parasite resistance. Lamb number 2, much higher fecal egg count EBV, more susceptible to parasitism. But based on just that one raw post-weaning fecal egg count, you'd think they're the same, right? They both about the same at 500 eggs per gram. So what's going on here? Maybe lamb number 1, again, parents, pedigree information, siblings that are lower than average, that have demonstrated, shown that they can pass on favorable parasite resistant low fecal egg count genetics. We maybe bring in some correlated traits, right? We know that this is a post-weaning fecal egg count. What if we go back and look at weaning fecal egg count? We know that if they have a lower fecal egg count at weaning, they're more likely to have a lower fecal egg count at the post-weaning time point. And so we know those traits are connected. So maybe this individual number 1 had a lower fecal egg count at weaning. And so between the pedigree information, the sibling information, and those genetic correlations between traits, we predict that lamb number 1 is going to have more favorable parasite resistant low fecal egg count genetics and thus has a lower fecal egg count EBV. Lamb number 2 on the other side of the spectrum here, parents, siblings, and a weaning fecal egg count that are greater than average, despite having the same raw fecal egg count at weaning, because of all this other information that contributes to the breeding value, we're going to say that individual, is probably more likely to actually pass on higher fecal egg count genetics and be more positive for that fecal egg count estimated breeding value. So here again, though, we have a selectable range, and I think this is kind of intriguing to me. I always think about St. Croix sheep. You probably heard Dr. Bowdridge talk yesterday. St. Croix sheep to me are the model of parasite resistance. They're a breed that I can pretty reliably go find some St. Croix sheep that are going to fight off parasitism and have low fecal egg counts. And still, even within the St. Croix breed, we see variation, right? We see some individuals that are more parasite resistant than other individuals. And so here we're looking at the opposite quadrant, right? Because we want low fecal egg counts, more parasite resistance. So if I want to find more parasite resistant St. Croix sheep, I'm going to identify breeding stock in this lower left quadrant with lower weaning and post-weaning fecal egg count EBVs. So EBVs allow us to accurately identify the good from the bad. So how does this look relative to, how do we utilize this information relative to our industry structure, where we fall in the industry structure and that industry pyramid, we could say? Up at the top of that pyramid, we have our elite and our multiplier seed stock producers, right? These are our purebred seed stock producers. And we expect those folks, and if you're one of those folks, you should be collecting lots of data. Utilizing that data to submit to NSIP. You should be NSIP members, generating breeding values, and being able to provide these really powerful, accurate genetic tools to your customer base. And your customer base is probably commercial producers. You might be selling some seed stock to other seed stock producers, but should be selling some rams to the commercial sector as well, right? So those commercial producers are going to benefit from all the data collection and the hard work that you did as a seed stock producer to be able to make genetic progress by utilizing and purchasing rams that are enrolled in NSIP with estimated breeding values. And so I think the really cool thing from a commercial producer's perspective is NSIP membership is not required for the commercial sector of the American sheep industry, right? They just need to go to you all that are seed stock producers that are enrolled in NSIP. They just need to go to you and buy some rams that are enrolled in NSIP that have favorable genetics based on estimated breeding values. And we're going to talk about here in a minute what that looks like. So NSIP can benefit all segments of the industry. Really, enrollment status is going to depend on your operations goals. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to raise purebreds and market seed stock? Then yeah, you should be a member. If you're just a commercial producer, there is no need to pay an annual membership fee to NSIP. I just encourage you to go to some seed stock producers and buy rams with breeding values. So do you need to enroll in NSIP, collect and submit data to benefit from the selection tools NSIP offers? The answer is no, right? You can, as a commercial producer, you can make all the genetic progress just like the seed stock sector does. You can conceptually utilize that same key equation for genetic progress. And if you're accurately identifying superior stud rams based on breeding values provided to you by the seed stock sector, you can make that progress. And you never have to enroll, you never have to submit data. And so that's pretty cool. It actually, like, I'm involved pretty heavily on the seed stock side of things, the purebred side of things. And, um, whenever I give a presentation like this, I kind of get excited. I'm like, kind of wish I just was a commercial producer. Like, that sounds fun. I can just go to ram sales and buy some good stud bucks based on their breeding values and turn them loose on my commercial use, and life would be good. And so how this might look, and if you're not doing this already, if it can be pretty simple, right? And so I've kind of narrowed this down, summarized it in 3 steps. And so step one, if you haven't already gone out, if you've not bought an NSIP stud buck before, I encourage you to do so. Find a sire that don't just buy any NSIP ram, buy a ram in NSIP that has breeding values with favorable genetics that reflect favorable genetics for your production system in your market. They've got to work for you. They've got to work for your market. They've got to work in your system. You can utilize EBVs to accurately identify those individuals. Step two, turn that ram loose on your commercial use. And I say commercial use, those are just non-NSIP use. Turn that NSIP sire loose on your use. Step three, retain those replacement females. Those replacement females, I call them F1s. They're not necessarily crossbreds, but I kind of think of it like you're crossing non-NSIP to NSIP. Those F1 females are 50% NSIP genetics, right? Half of the genetic merit comes from the sire. So regardless of what the females are, half of their genetics are now NSIP genetics. And so next step, you're just going to repeat steps 1 through 3. You're going to buy another NSIP ram that's maybe not related to that first one you bought. You're going to use that ram on your 50% use, your 50% NSIP commercial use. Retain those females. And now you can think about that next generation. Those are 75% NSIP genetics. Okay. We've bought 2 rams and we're already, at 3/4 blood NSIP genetics. And all I've done is buy 2 rams and use them on my use. We're going to do that again. We're going to buy another NSIP ram, use them on my 75% use. And that third generation, now we're up to 87.5%. We've almost made it to 90%. And all we've done is buy three NSIP rams. And then I'm going to do it one more time. Buy another NSIP sire, use him on my 87.5%ers. And that fourth generation, those replacement females are going to be 94% NSIP genetics. So I have in 4 generations, by utilizing NSIP rams with favorable genetics for your production system, your environment, your market, by purchasing, as little as 4 new rams, you now have a set of replacement females that their genetic merit, their genes represent, over 90% of their genes represent NSIP genetics. You've never enrolled, you've never submitted any data, and in a few years, you have more NSIP genetics than a lot of the US sheep population. So it's really as easy as 1, 2, 3, right? Buy NSIP sires, use them on your use, retain replacement females, and in as little as 4 new ram purchases, you can have over 90% NSIP genetics by never enrolling, never submitting any data, simply buying favorable, high genetic merit, high quality NSIP rams and retaining females out of those rams. So pretty cool, right? It can be as simple as that. And so just because you're a commercial producer, don't think you can't benefit from this. I think there's tremendous benefit to be had within the commercial sector, and it can be relatively simple to get done. So in summary, NSIP offers the most powerful genetic selection tools we have available through those estimated breeding values. In the seed stock sector, they need to be collecting data, submitting data to utilize to calculate those breeding values. And so encourage seed stock producers to be enrolled and offer EBVs on rams and ewes that are marketed as breeding stock. And within the commercial sector, there's a tremendous opportunity to capitalize on that genetic improvement potential, utilizing breeding values without ever having to do the same level of data collection that the seed stock sector is doing by simply purchasing those NSIP rams and using them and keeping back daughters. And so you can buy maternal rams, you can buy terminal rams, and so you can make both replacement females and terminal market lambs. And that's a whole nother conversation presentation to have. But I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And continue to discuss this. If you want more information about enrolling in an SIP, we can certainly get you that information. And so I think it's a great resource, great tool that we have available in the U.S. sheep industry, and probably underutilized if we really step back and look at NSIP membership relative to the entire industry. So happy to answer any questions if we have some time here.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's see if you can hear us clapping.
I can. Thank you.
Okay. For time's sake, we're going to go ahead and take just a couple questions. And I'll go ahead and pass the mic in this room, or if there are any questions online, Crystal. Here, let me go ahead and if they're online, Andrew, you can go ahead and read those in the chat.
Yeah. So, sorry about that. There we go. Let's see in the chat here. What levels of coefficient of relatedness in sheep Katahdins are there negative impacts on EBV? So I assume you're kind of relating to inbreeding coefficients and thinking about, as we increase inbreeding, there is that inbreeding depression, and we generally see a reduction in animal performance as a result of inbreeding. I do not know off the top of my head the exact impacts, the data on fecal egg count EBVs. Generally speaking, and it's like this could be a whole nother hour-long presentation, but through inbreeding, we're increasing homozygosity, the similarities within that genome, right? And so, we could, on one side, by utilizing what we call, I joke, it's line breeding if it works, it's inbreeding if it doesn't. By strategic line breeding, you could actually pair up some very favorable genes and get very superior predictable performance, right? That's kind of the ideal situation. If I can do some strategic line breeding, and I'm one of those individuals that is not afraid to line animals up a little bit, because I do think they breed truer, they breed more predictably, and I like that about breeding stock, and I have more confidence in breeding stock like that. But then it's balancing that against the potential negative impacts, particularly on from a fitness, survival, maternal side of things. If we get too high of inbreeding coefficient, we generally start seeing negative impacts on lamb survival, and so fitness, thriftiness, things like that. So there's a balance there. I typically hear about 12.5% is where maybe the cutoff should be. I know some flocks that are maybe a little above that, lots of flocks below that. I'm pretty comfortable riding it up pretty close to that point. And so it's up to the individual producer. If I'm a commercial producer and my goal is to produce pounds of lamb per ewe exposed to breeding, I want to minimize inbreeding to the greatest extent possible, right? But if I'm a purebred producer and I'm trying to make predictable genetics to sell to my customer base, then some strategic planned line breeding is not always a bad thing. And then there St. Croix, when will St. Croix genetic heritability be available? So right now the St. Croix are running as with the 64, the same breed group as the Katahdins. And so to my knowledge, they're all of the heritabilities, the genetic parameters are being based off what we're running with Katahdins. Dr. Notter once told me when I was in grad school, the average Katahdin is probably 50 to 60% St. Croix. And so, we know that those breeds are relatively related. So I think those parameters are, for what we have available, pretty accurate, and probably the best, they are the best we have. And so it really takes, the more animals we have within a population, the better we can predict what those parameters are. So you all as St. Croix breeders, the more of you that can enroll, be a part of NSIP, and provide a data set for geneticists to utilize and analyze, the better we can do at providing the best, the greatest parameters in that evaluation to predict these breeding values. There's some questions about membership costs, and Crystal threw that in there, so appreciate her doing that. And yeah, there is an annual enrollment fee. If you think about the value that provides, and keep in mind that the lamb fee is a one-time fee. So I pay a fixed amount per lamb, and then I can submit one data point. I can submit 10 data points on that lamb, all underneath that one fee. So you just pay it once, and then I can submit birth data, weaning data, post-weaning data, lambing records on that ewe when she enters production. And so just want to mention that. Experienced men breeding depression in goats, but didn't have homozygosity testing available at the time. Would have loved that info. So it looks like we've gotten through the questions in the chat that I see. So
we
are
have
there
a
any
couple
in the audience?
Hey, we have a couple questions here, Andrew.
Yeah.
Let's just take a couple. You had one, Lori.
Yeah, I do. This question will sound a little skeptical, so I hope you can reassure me. Are there any verification studies? So, say a small commercial flock measured their FECs and got an average, and then they bred to an NSIP ram with great FEC EBVs. And then they rechecked the small commercial flock, and yeah, there were fewer, there's better parasite resistance in that commercial flock now. It doesn't work in the real world, is what I'm kind of asking. Is there anything that says, yes, it does?
Yeah. So actually, that's a great question, because that was my PhD project. And so we did that. I was a student at WVU with Dr. Bowdridge. We did all that work at the Glade Spring Research Station in Southwest Virginia. And so we just took rams that were really high fecal light count, rams that were really low fecal light count, and randomly mated them to a group of ewes, and then evaluated those lambs. So there's no selection on the female side, only on the ram side, and you get nice divergence, just like the fecal light count EBVs would suggest. Higher fecal light counts in lamb side by high fecal light count rams, lower fecal light counts in lamb side by low fecal light count rams. And so even with no selection on the female side, just utilizing rams that are high or low, you're going to get lambs that trend in that general direction. So on the fecal light count side, we have that data is published now. And then on the growth and carcass side of things, I'll mention the Leading Edge project, the Mickle project that those of you in Utah are probably familiar with. I think that's probably the best demonstration of the impact that selection based on breeding values can have in a large commercial range flock. So that was utilizing Suffolk rams selected for high growth or high muscle, and then followed those lambs in a multi-sire mating group on range all the way through the feedlot sector into harvest, and looked at carcass merit, and they line up. I think the post-weaning fecal light count EBV predicted weight differences in lambs within a half a pound. And that's across like 1,000 or 2,000 lambs. So
that's great. We have one more question here. And then we'll go ahead and end there with this last question.
Okay.
How does evaluating multiple traits work with NSIP? For example, and maybe this is gender specific, but say I want to look at maternal production traits, and I want to look at post-weaning weights that are higher at a lower age. Or so how can you utilize it for looking at multiple traits within your seed stock flock?
Yeah, so the general rule of thumb, the more traits you select for at once, the less progress you're going to make in any single trait. It's really hard to find outlier individuals for all traits. You can certainly find outlier individuals for 2 or 3 traits. And so we have these breeding values. We know there are, those genetic correlations between traits, but there's always outliers. And so there's always individuals, I kind of think of them maybe like as curve benders. They're individuals that are maybe genetic anomalies. We generally think that, I'll just jump to cattle real quick for an example. We want lower birth weights in cattle, higher yearling weights. And so You find those animals that have that big spread that, genetically speaking, if they're heavier at birth, they should be heavier at post-weaning yearling age. But we can also find individuals that have low birth weights and also have high yearling weights. In the sheep deal, it's the same situation. So we can find individuals that, while there are correlations between weaning fecal light count, post-weaning fecal light count, there's actually some genetic correlations between parasite resistance and prolificacy values. Generally, animals that are more prolific have higher fecal light counts. You can find the outliers. You can still find the individuals that are prolific and have low fecal light counts. You just got to look a little harder. And so I think those opportunities still exist, and the breeding values take all of that into account in the background, so that when we get that list of EBVs on our animals on a lamb crop, it's sorting them. It's got the ewe lambs, it's got the ram lambs, taking into account sex differences, taking into account litter size differences, UH differences, things like that, and it allows us to utilize those EBVs, and it can get relatively simple, because what we see, that EBV that's printed out, that's provided to us, all the hard work, the legwork has been done on the backside of that. And so we can take that EBV for what it is, compare that EBV, or, pick those 2, 3, 4 EBVs that we're going to focus on, and find those individuals that most closely align with our breeding objectives. And even if they're breeding objectives that require us selecting traits that don't always align with one another, with a little bit of time and a few generations, we can find those individuals that allow us to do both. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. It ultimately ends up taking the information you're getting, and within yourself valuing, moving that flux more slowly, yes, but moving it in 2 directions at once. And to do that, you take the individual traits and you mesh the outliers in each, see where they come together, and work along that way.
Can I ask you a question on that? It kind of goes with that, Andrew.
Yeah.
Is there like a hair sheep St. Croix Katahdin index that we have right now, similar to the Western Range Index, that weights out the characteristics that make us money here in the West? I mean, is there something like that in hair sheep currently?
Yeah, so we have, we call it the maternal hair index. It has nothing to do with hair shedding. It's just the maternal index for hair sheep. That index is based on a predictor of pounds of lamb weaned per ewe lambing. And so weight of lamb weaned per ewe lambing is technically in kilograms. But it's going to take into account number born, number weaned, maternal weaning weight, which is milk production, and lamb weaning weight, to predict essentially litter size, combine that with weight traits to get total pounds of lamb weaned. So that really serves as a maternal index. Fecal light count is not in that. And I think that provides us a valuable tool that we can select for parasite resistance and maternal attributes together or separately to the extent that we want. And so if you want both, you can select for both. If you want more of one and less of the other, you can do that. And so it allows you that flexibility. And so we don't have like an all-purpose index. We don't have like a $C in the cattle industry. We don't have an index that brings together like carcass measurements, carcass merits, post-weaning performance, and maternal performance. We just have really the maternal index right now. Long term, there might be some more indexes that come out. Right now, that's just all we have to work with. So that does provide, it kind of simplifies selection for those maternal characteristics, certainly.
I really appreciate that, Andrew. Once again, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. You are not here in person, so you will not receive wool socks from me right now. But if I do see you at the ram sale and I think you're pushing rams good enough, I will give you a pair. Okay.
Sounds good. I'll make sure I work hard. So
hey, thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
I will, yeah, thanks again for having me, and we'll see you and hopefully some of the rest of y'all at the ram sale here in a few weeks.